Yes, it's Destination Uri, the morning programme. I'm Rowan Hand. This is Martin Savage. Guru, judo master of Warren Point, a Japanophile, we could call you. And you love the things of Japan. Yeah. You've been doing some academic studies and you've succeeded in getting a certain linguistic qualification.
It's a strange thing. It's a long, elongated type of thing. Well, I've always been interested in Japanese language, and 20 odd years ago I went to Queen's University night classes.
Yes.
And took level 1 and level 2. But at that stage there weren't enough people to do a level 3. And I sort of just put it in the back burner for a long time. So 20 years later this year, right, I looked and found it was a level 3 course. So I went to this level 3 course, and there am I in with guys who are undergraduates, right? 20 years old, 21 years old enough to be their grandfather.
Of course.
People who weren't even born when I was doing the last course.
Yeah.
And but it was very interesting. It was very good. Yes, I enjoyed it.
And what kind of people were giving the course?
It was Japanese woman.
Japanese folk.
Yeah, she's a Japanese woman. Yoko Hando.
Yoko Hando.
Yoko Hando sensei. Yeah, she's very good. Yeah, she's been living in Belfast, I think, for 5 years. She's married.
And what is what is the secret of the language? If you say to me Japanese, I tend to say immediately and think immediately, very, very hard, very, very complicated.
It's in some ways it's harder than English. It's more difficult than English, and in some ways it's much easier.
Yeah.
There's 3 different alphabets. Right. There's the 2 main alphabets probably are hiragana and katakana, right? And they are syllabic, right?
Yes.
They're not based on letters like the English alphabet.
Sounds. When we say syllabic, we mean sounds.
Well, say for example, there's a little symbol that would represent the syllable hicha, say for example. Ha, right?
Ha.
You know, a, e, I, o, u, mami, mai, mo, mu.
Mami, mama, moo.
Ha, he, hi, ho, hu. You know, we're syllables.
Hi, ho, hu.
And once you know those symbols, and that's the difficulty, is learning those symbols, because there's 45, 46 of them.
Yes.
Right? Once you know the symbols, then you can look at the words and you can pronounce the words very, very easily. They're much easier to pronounce the language than it is in English, say, for example, because you've got the word B-O-U-G-H in English, and you look at it and you say, oh, that's bow.
Yes.
Right? And then you look at C-O-U-G-H and you say, oh, that's cough.
Yeah. It's just difficult.
It doesn't sound the same.
No such ambiguity exists in the Japanese.
Not in speaking. The difficulty is in reading it, I think, you know, because there's 3 different alphabets. There's one which is just for purely Japanese words, that's called hiragana. There's Western words that have been adopted into the Japanese language, and there aren't sounds in Japanese for those words.
Yes.
You know, so they have another syllabic alphabet for that called katakana. And then they've got the basic kanji, which are the little symbols.
Yes.
Right, the little pictographs.
Oh, yes.
That they've got from Chinese.
Yeah.
Right, and it's exactly the same as Chinese. The pictograph in Japanese and in Chinese mean the same thing, but there's 2 different pronunciations.
I see.
Right?
Yes.
You know, be pronounced differently.
You surround yourself with these Japanese things with great courage, because as you said, you could be their grandfather. The human mind, has it got the capacity as it grows older to take these things in as easily as it did when you did the level 1 and 2?
No, I don't think so. I think it's more difficult now, certainly.
You see, people will say to you, fellas, the folk over at the Southern Regional College, they talk about learning for life. Come and do the course.
Yeah.
The U3A, the University of Third Age.
Yeah.
Learning for life, you must keep learning. When they say you must keep learning, I say, I must rest my brain and get the best out of it.
No, I don't think you should rest it, but I think you must be aware that things probably just won't come to you as easily. I think there's a balance. I think on the other side of that, you've got a durability. You can see that you can get somewhere if you keep at it.
Yes.
I think the younger people sometimes give up too easily. You know, There are too many other things to do. Mm-hmm. I'm coming from that. I'm coming from Japanese now to Japanese now, in a sense that I don't really have anything else. I have no work responsibilities. Yes. I can concentrate more of my time and effort on it, whereas younger people would have other diversions. But certainly, I read actually the other day a guy called Jacob Rees. He's a journalist and a social sort of observer, if you like.
Yes, yes.
And he's talking about the difficulty of learning Japanese in particular, right? And he said it was the stonemason type thing. You've got a stonemason, and he's chipping away and he's hammering away, and nothing happens for a long, long time. And then all of a sudden, the piece of block, the block that he's working on, just breaks. And I said it doesn't break because of the last stroke. It breaks because of the hundreds of strokes that have gone before. And sometimes learning the Japanese language is a bit like that. You think you're getting nowhere, but inside there's a subconscious type of learning going on that you're not aware of, and all of a sudden it just comes to you.
The gates open. And
it's like a eureka moment.
A eureka moment.
Yeah.
But I mean, how do you get practicing your Japanese? Do you torture your poor lady in the house?
No, I don't know. I don't do that.
No, you're a wise man.
She can't even understand me in English, never mind in Japanese. No, I just have to work myself and listen. You know, we've got NHK on the satellite.
That's the Japanese
channel. You know, although a lot of that's in English. You know,
Yeah.
Listen to that, and I've got videotapes and loads of books and things. So you know, I've got on the net, on YouTube, there's judo videos that are in Japanese, so you listen to those and you pick up the odd expression. But that's the other difficult thing.
Please.
It's listening to the language. It's very difficult. Yeah.
So you would recommend the judo that one can get off the YouTube? We can get that.
Oh, you can get judo off YouTube. Great. There's some rubbish on it, like everything else, but some of it is very good.
Well, we'll do that. We'll do that today. We'll get some judo from the YouTube and introduce our wider audience to Japanese judo in there where it is. Can you remember a time in your life, Martin, when you were not interested in Japanese things?
Probably when you go back to childhood.
But then put it another way. At what point were you aware of the flowering of interest?
Well, the interest came initially through judo. Right?
Yeah.
Before there was any interest in Japan, really as a country, and I think it was a sort of a drip feed type of thing, because you became interested in judo, right? Then obviously the connection from judo to Japan, although lots of countries did judo, right, you automatically made the connection judo and Japan, and then you started, you know, that led you into things Japanese culture, Japanese language initially, because the judo techniques are named in Japanese language. You know, it's a universal language.
Yes.
You can go to a judo practice or a dojo anywhere in the world, and the names of the techniques will be exactly the same. You know, they're not translated into their own language.
Yes.
And so it was Japanese language first. And then, of course, once you started learning a little bit of Japanese language, you wanted to learn more. And then, of course, you start thinking about, well, maybe I should go to Japan. Maybe going to Japan's a good idea. I better learn more about Japan to go there. But I think you get more from it the more you know. I think that's what happens to a lot of people. They go to Japan and they don't research it. They don't understand it. Yeah. And then it comes like a culture shock to them. It's a slap in the face, really.
Your first visit to Japan, tell me just the kind of moment, the door of the airplane opens, you're in Japan. What was in the heart of Martin Savage at that moment?
Well, the strange thing, it's a thought that comes to me. It was the time of the Asian flu.
Oh, I better watch myself here.
Yeah, and you're coming into Narita Airport, and they have a sensor there that would pick up temperatures, you know, just from a distance, you know, of anybody who had a temperature. And you're sort of thinking, you know, well, am I going to get past this? But certainly the first thought is that everybody, you know, well, maybe not everybody, but I would say 90% of the people there were Japanese.
Yes.
And you were this tall gaijin foreigner, right? I was there. Initially, I went there with my kata partner and judo partner, Paul Brady, and we weren't the only two Westerners on the plane. We were two of the few Westerners on the plane. And I think you get that. But I think coming into Tokyo, then it's industrialized on the outskirts, and you think to yourself, this is not the Japan that I thought I was going to see. But once you get into the center of it, it's a big city. Yeah. But it's totally different to other big cities.
In what way?
In New York, it's an organized chaos, right? If you like, I think New York to me is just chaos.
Yeah.
Everybody doing their own thing. But in Japan, if you look at it from the outside, it looks to be very, very similar. But when you're in there, in the middle of that, you realize that there's an order. And it's not as if somebody's standing back directing it. Yeah. I think it's an internal discipline, an internal structure that they have in themselves that guides them to do things in a way that's not obtrusive. It doesn't get in the way of anybody else.
Why, I'm not being unkind, but why does an army of ants, if you watch ants coming and going out of their nest and coming and carrying little leaves and little bits back, they never collide. They're moving all the time, and it seems to be working well. So is it cruel of me to think in that way of the Japanese people?
I don't think so. I suppose yes. I think that they do work at the how would you put, the group is very important in Japan.
Yes.
In all levels of society, the group is more important than the individual.
You see, I wouldn't do very well there. Because I'm a kind of cantankerous fellow who's not very good in groups. I walk alone very, very well. Would I be an oddity in Japan in that sense?
Well, you wouldn't be an oddity in the sense that you're a gaijin, you're a foreigner, and they expect that from you. But no, I don't think so. I think there was a while back, well, it was quite a while back, could be 30, 40 years ago. I think, it's funny how 40 years just goes like that. But there was one of the British team judo coaches tried to impose this group structure on the British judo team because they just come back from Japan, and it almost broke the team apart. It just doesn't work.
And it applies not only to, not only to sport, it applies in business. They're all there. And we have seen instances of the heads, the chief executive officers of businesses, almost going to commit hara-kiri because of failure of the accounts and the great apologies, the bowing apologies that occur, the tears and the shame of having let people down.
Well, I know of one person who actually did that. Isao Nakama, a Japanese Olympian, won the Olympics in '64, and he was the CEO of of his business. And I don't know the details, but maybe could be 10, 15 years ago, he committed hara-kiri, or seppuku. Seppuku is the more polite way of saying it. Hara-kiri means to stomach cut. Right? Or seppuku is a more it's a wouldn't say a gentler term, but a more polite term to use. He did that. He actually, I never met the man, but he signed my 4th Dan judo certificate.
My goodness. My goodness. My goodness. They have a reputation, and I don't know, you're a kindly man, you're an Irish man, you have a Nuri family provenance, and there's no cruelty in you. But the Japanese, through the war, had a reputation for cruelty. What was all that about?
I think it was misguided, I think, in the main. It was a misguided nationalism, right? I think the people who were involved, Japanese at that time were governed, well, still to a certain extent, Bushido, the code of the samurai, right? The code of Budo, the art of fighting, if you like. And I think in the main, the Japanese army, the soldiers who were fighting, right, in Manchuria and China, they were sold, if you like, a misguided interpretation of what Bushido was. And because they were being told this by their superiors, who they believed totally and absolutely in, right, they followed it, right? And I've said to you before, we use this expression, the chrysanthemum and the sword. Japanese has it's two sides. They can be very, very artistic, very literary minded, very sophisticated people. But equally, on the other side of the coin, you've got this warlike nature where they can go to war. For example, this might strike you as cruelty, and it probably would be cruelty in our part of the world. But a samurai who was going into a very important battle would have killed his family before he went into battle.
My goodness.
Right? Because it would have been a distraction. He would have been in battle thinking about what was happening to his family back home. Had the battle been lost, what was going to happen to them? And that, he thought, would have taken away from his concentration on the job in hand. So he would have got rid of that just by killing his family.
My goodness.
A strange way to look at things, but that's the way they would have done it.
Is the part of you would love to have been a samurai?
I don't think so.
No.
Great responsibility, I think.
Really? In what sense responsibility?
Because you had a code to uphold. And things that you were expected to do. Now, maybe if I was Japanese, that would be a much, much easier thing to do. But from a Western point of view, there would be aspects of that code that, certainly, some of that code permeates into judo, permeates into martial arts, but there's huge amounts of it that you just couldn't sign up to with our Western psychology.
In the times we're talking about, the times of the cruelty of the war, perceived cruelty during the war, the emperor would have been strong. He was in his palace. What might the emperor's life have been like in there? People didn't talk to him. He didn't talk to them.
He didn't speak. In fact, whenever he announced in '45 that the war was over and that Japan had surrendered, that was the first time a lot of people have heard him speak. It was on the radio, obviously. A lot of people heard him speak, and that was the first time they heard him speak. I think there are films of the emperor, you know, and his wife and family, you know, at those times, but they did leave. I've been to the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, and it's a huge building. You know, it's a 6 mile run around the outside of it. You know, so it's a huge building, and I think he would have been cocooned in there to a large extent. He was treated as a god. In fact, he was a god.
Were there,
you know,
from your best understanding, were there people who had the power to control him? Was he, to some extent, a kind of icon? Which could be controlled by a more powerful group within Japanese society?
I think the Japanese military controlled that situation in the Second World War. Absolutely. You know, people like Tojo,
yeah,
you know, they would have controlled that very much so, and they would have, you know, war policy would have been driven by them, by the military, and not from
the palace,
not from the emperor. No.
You know, I think of Pearl Harbor. I think, like, I mean, that was a huge outreach, military outreach, right across the Pacific to attack Pearl Harbor. It was an audacious kind of exploit.
Yeah, I think it people say it epitomizes the sneaky Japanese sort of approach to things. I don't know the full story of Pearl Harbor's ever been told. I don't know if we know the full details. People say the Americans did know about it. They were aware that it was going to happen, or they were aware that something was going to happen, and didn't take it seriously.
And it would have allowed them the excuse to get involved. And of course, the Enola Gay and all of that, and the dropping of the bombs in Japan. The ultimate cruelty, perhaps. We talked about cruelty of the Japanese, but that's an ultimate cruelty of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the death of the tens and tens and tens of thousands of people. Would the Japanese have had any indication that that kind of thing was going to occur?
I don't think so.
Just came
not even the Japanese. I don't think anybody in the whole world, other than the few Americans who were in on it, were aware of exactly what was going to happen, and maybe they weren't even aware of what the repercussions of that would be. I think there's reverberations of all that coming through even today, you know, I mean, 70 odd years later, is that the Japanese are still being held to task over the cruelties in prisoner war camps, and the raping of Nanking and Shanghai and places in China. So they're asking Shinzo Abe, who's the Prime Minister, right, on the 70th anniversary, I think it is, right, to come out again and apologise. And he's been very sort of coy about it. He says, this has been done before, I'm not going to do it again.
I think so.
You know, but the other issue that's coming out of this, and it's funny the way, you know, history is a habit of coming down, right down the line and affecting things today, is that one of the consequences of the Japanese surrender was that there was a constitution drawn up where they could not send military into other countries to fight, except it was in defence of Japan.
Yes, yeah.
And this was a sort of a bilateral agreement with the Americans. In April, Abe, the Prime Minister again, with Obama, has renegotiated that. In a sense, it's Obama's sort of directive that it be reinterpreted that they can go to the aid of allies, and by allies, substitute USA.
Yes, of course.
You know, now, 2/3 apparently of the Japanese voting public are totally against this. They see this as going back a backward step and don't want to get involved. And Abe's sort of treading water on it at the moment, so we don't know what's going to happen there. But you know, if it went ahead, sometime in the near future, you could see Japanese troops fighting alongside American troops.
My goodness, you know, how the world changes,
doesn't it? Just
yeah. This is Martin Savage. I'm Rowan Hand.
Thank you, sir.